This is the second part of a series of videos to be posted online as a makeup lecture for CS 5229. In this video, I will introduce more advanced features of Tickle, including the data structures and the control structures in Tickle. First, let's talk about list. Recall that in Tickle, I can use either the curly bracket or a double quote to create a word that contains spaces. Now, a variable whose value contains spaces can be treated as a list. So, for example, I just created two lists, X and Y. Tickle provides several commands that takes in lists as an argument. So for example, L index, let's talk about L length. L length takes in a list and return the number of elements in the list. L index takes in two arguments. The first is the list and the second is a position, and it will return the item at that particular position in the list. So in the list X, the item at position number 2, 0, 1, 2 is C, and therefore C is returned. You can append to the list by using the command lappend. Lappend takes in the name of the variable and the item to append, for example E, and it will append E to the list X. You can also simply append an item by the following. You can set X to $X of F. Now the new line here is unintentional. So but the point, what I show here is that if I set X to $X, recall that if I use double quote, Tickle will substitute $X with the value of X, which is A, B, C, D, E, and therefore X will now become A, B, C, D, E, F. It is often useful to iterate through all the items in a list. So to that, the command for each is useful. For each takes in three arguments. The first is a variable, let me say I. The second argument is a list, let's say X. And the third argument is what you want to do with each element in the list. So for example, I want to iterate through every element in the list X and print it out on the screen. So I say put as $I and do a close bracket, and this is what I get. I can also pass in more than one variable as the first argument for each. So let's see what happens if I pass in I and J as the first argument. Now instead of put as $I put as $I$J, and this is what we get. We get AB on one line, CD and EF. Now what happens when we pass in more than one variable is that the first variable will be assigned to the first element, the second variable will be assigned to the second element, and this code here will be executed. In the next iteration, I will be assigned to the third element, J will be assigned to the fourth element, and so on and so on. to find out more about list and the other commands that Tcl provides that operates on list, you can look at the documentation of Tcl available at www.tcl.tk/doc, and okay, I think you can find it yourself. Maybe I will come back to the website later while it is loading. Let's look at another data structure that is useful in Tcl, which is array. So we use parentheses to denote an array. So if I say set a 2 in parentheses for, what I have just created is an array variable where the index position in the array of 2 has been assigned the value of 4. I can say set a of 1 equals to 2, etc. And I just set another element in the array at index 1 to the value of 2. Now, the indices need not be consecutive. So I can say set a of say 1000 to 2000, but the array would still contains only 3 elements. Okay, position 1, position 2, and position 1000. This is because an array in Tcl is not really an array. An array in Tcl is more like a hash table. So I can pass in, I don't necessarily have to pass in integer as an index to the array. I can pass in, for example, a string. Let's say b of ftp to be 21, set b of http to be 80, set b of ssh to be 22. Okay. So b is an array, and at index ftp it has a value of 21. And I can mix integer and string in one array. So for example, I can set a of 0 to be 0. This is still a valid array. There we go. So beside a bunch of commands that operates on the list, Tcl provides a command called array that manipulates array variables. So let's look at some of these. Array name return the list of all indices in the array B. Array name also takes in an optional argument, which is a regular expression, and if this is the case, then array name will only return all the indices in the array B that matches this regular expression. In this case, the regular expression says I want anything that ends with P, and therefore HTTP and FTP are returned and not SSH. Another command, array get, return a pair of key and value in a list. So this can be useful in the following way. I can use for each, pass in 2 variables, and I can iterate through all the elements in an array and print out their value, for example. So key users port value, and so it will print out the following protocol or uses the following port on the screen. Now let's look at some control structure in Tcl. We have seen a while loop. Let's see, set C equals to 10 while C is bigger than 1, put S of C. Okay? So this is a while loop, very similar to the one you see previously. You have also see a for each loop. Right? Another way where you can loop in Tcl is to use a for loop. Now the structure of for loop is very similar to for loop in C or Java. So a for loop in Tcl takes in 4 arguments. Right? The first one is the initialization. Right? I can say set x equals to 0. The second one is the condition. So I can say $x is less than 10. And the third one is what you want to do after every iteration. In this case, I want to increase x by 1. Tcl provides a command for us to do this easily. The command is called increment. So I can say increment and I pass in the name of a variable. In this case x, and what increment x will do is it will increment the value of the variable by 1. The fourth argument, as expected, is the code that you want to execute at each iteration. So in this case, again, I'll just print out the value of x on the screen, and there you go, we have a for loop. Now note that increment can take in an optional argument which tells us how much we want to increment. So if I say increment x of 2, the value of x becomes 12. If I say increment of x minus 4 minus 3, the value of x becomes 9. Note that increment only works on integer. So if I say increment of x 0.3, it will complain of an error. Well, we have seen loops. Now let's look at the branching structure in Tcl. Tcl provides an if command. Right? So the if command takes in, as expected, a condition. So if I say if x is bigger than 0, then I pass in the code what to do when x is bigger than 0. In this case, I'll put, let's say, positive. Else if x is less than 0, then I will put as negative, and else what I'll do is I'll just put as 0. So in this case, in the value of x, the value of x is 9, positive will be printed. Finally, let me show you how you can define a new command in Tcl. The command to create a new command is proc, or a short for procedure. Proc takes in 3 arguments. The first argument is the name of the new proc. So let me say I want want to write a function to compute the factorial. Right. So I name my function or my command factorial, takes in an argument. So this argument is passed as an argument to the command prop. So if I say factorial of n, and the third argument, the prop, is what is the body of the function factorial. Right. So to compute factorial, I create a variable called product, set product to 1, initialize it to 1, and then for set I to 1, I less than n, or actually I less than equals to n, I increment I, and at every step I update my product by multiplying it with product multiply by I. And finally, after I compute everything, I return the value of the product. So I have just defined a new command called factorial, which takes in an argument n and return the factorial of that product. So let's see if this works. If I pass in factorial of 3, it should return me 3 times 2 times 1, which is 6. Now of course this code is not rigorous, because if I find in factorial 0 is if I pass in factorial 0, it returns 1. Oh, it still works. Okay. Now one thing nice about Tcl is that command can be dynamically defined and redefined. Consider the following example. Let's say I want to create a procedure that can be called only once. Right? So the first time I call this procedure, I will just print out the value of the argument. But after I print out the value of the argument, I redefine the procedure such that it prints an error message that says you can only call this procedure once. Right? So let's see what happens. If I say call one time 10, the first time it should tell me, it should print out the value of 10. The second time, when I call this, it will complain that I can only call this procedure once, because the first time when I call this, it has redefined the procedure. Okay, so this is how you would define a new command by using the command called proc. Now the last thing that I want to talk about Tcl is global variable. Now, the command global takes in a list of variable names which will be made global variable in Tcl. So if I say global, say x, x will now become a global variable. So if I set x of 1, I now have a global variable whose value is 1. Now, to use this global variable elsewhere, for example, in a procedure, I need to define global of x inside the procedure. So let's say I define a function foo which doesn't take in anything, but he wants to print out the value x. If I just call this, I will receive an error which says that the value x can't be read. But if I now use the command global and pass in the name of the variable x, I can now access this global variable x here, and this function should now print out the value 1. So if I say foo, it now prints out 1 correctly. So this concludes my brief introduction to Tickle. There are many more useful commands in Tickle, which you can find out by looking at the man pages. What I have shown you should be sufficient for you to move on to Tickle and then to NS2. In the next video, I will show you how to use Tickle.